So I'm going to walk through a couple different projects. The first one is just to show you a little bit about what you can do quickly using, let's say these were photographs I took using an iPhone, an old one, an iPhone 6S. So you don't need a fancy camera of any kind. You can just use your smartphone and get a pretty good result. So I'm going to close this one. So opening reality capture, the first step is to bring your photos into the software itself, and you begin basically in reality capture you have different options. So you can start with the quick start search menu, or you can begin with different types of panels up. If you're new to the software, this is helpful, where you have the search function and the quick start and instructions for various different kind of tasks. But the quick start menu will get you pretty much what you need to get up and running right away without too much difficulty. Once you're used to the workflow, then this layout where you have the 3D view up here in the upper right, you can set what type of view you want to have available, 1D, 2D, 3D, 4D if you have animation. So I like to have the 3D view large so you can see your model once it's constructed, where you can see your point clouds, etc. And then on the left panel, I like to leave either in 2D or 1D, 2D being your photos. So I'll bring these photos in of this door with some details. It's a metal door that has been oxidized, and it has some nice details on it. The types of details that would take a fair bit of time to sculpt. So something like this can be nice to use photogrammetry to get a nice model, a nice asset that you can then use for rendering purposes. You can use in a game engine. You can use for 3D printing if you're working on an architectural model and you want to have some nice details, whatever your project might require. So you drag them into this left 2D panel, and you can see all your photos. If you pull the slider down, make sure they all import. And they import. It's good to have your photos be, as we discussed in the photography lecture, it's good to have all your photos be oriented the same direction. So either landscape or portrait. So you can see that I have all portrait mode photographs here. It doesn't necessarily require that, but sometimes you just get a better result if they're all in the same orientation. So once you have your photos imported, then the next step is simply to align the images, and the software takes care of this process. And this can take a little while. It can take a few minutes up to maybe half an hour, something like that, depending on the size of the photographs and the number of photographs. So I went through this process already, so I'm going to abort right now and just open the model that's already been completed using these same photos. So no, I won't save. Let's see. Open. So here we have the point cloud that once it's been aligned, visible from the same set of photographs. And you can see in the three-dimensional view, it has resolved these little cameras are all photographs. It's resolved the position of the camera for each of the photographs, and then given this point cloud result. And you can see that there, of course, are areas that it could resolve and areas that it could not resolve. So, you know, the parts that weren't visible in the photographs, of course, it has to just leave no information there. And that has an impact on the mesh, the quality of the mesh, of course. So if this upper part was important, you would want to bring a ladder to the site or something like that that would allow you to photograph the upper portion of this model as well. But you can see from these, if I look from the top view, you can see that the camera angles onto the model reflect, you know, trying to capture details from at least 3 sides. And you usually want, as we discussed in the photography lecture, about a 60% overlap between photos to get the amount of details right. But you can see in this point cloud, or once it had been reconstructed, once you go through that process, which I will detail in a separate lecture later, in the nitty-gritty of the software and of decimation, you can see from the point cloud to the solid model here. Obviously, it's not a perfect. There are imperfections, of course, in the stone, but not to this extent that you see over here on the left or over here on the right, as well as on the metal door to a lesser extent. These kinds of surface imperfections aren't part of the model itself. They're things that are artifacts of the mesh generation here. So that's why we would need to bring this into ZBrush later to do surface reconstruction, or use the tools available in reality capture to do mesh repair and smoothing of the surface and things of that nature. But often you'll get a pretty good result from reality capture, but you can't be as precise or as targeted as you could be in ZBrush or in Rhino. If it's a planar surface that you want to reconstruct, then you can be much more precise in those other softwares. But you can see that it really does capture the details nicely of this relief. It gives you a really good starting point. And then of the details, you know, along the framing around the relief and the sculpted metal handle to the door, as well as a pretty nice starting point for this grill, especially if you want to later texture, use a simplified model and use textures. You can get some pretty good detail. And because they're planar, you can get a very low resolution model with good textures. Again, for rendering or for you know, manufacturing specs or whatever you would like to use it for. So here you see the solid model, and in this case, it's like these are colored vertices. This model, now the next step you'll see is that you can bring this over on the left panel from the 2D view up here on the upper left. You can change it to a 1D view, and you'll see that this component element here, if I open this up to see what's below, it has camera poses and then it has your model. And the initial model is labeled Model 1, and you'll see here that it's at 21.5 million triangles, so 21.5 million polygons. That's a lot. So, you know, you have to decimate it and then export it for remodeling or for repair. in another software. But you have to decimate it before you export it. So I want to show you, this was an example of a fairly simple element that could be captured quickly with a smaller number of photographs. And then I want to show you the thought process for a larger type of project. Still not a massive project, but a more complicated project than a simple planar door with that's recessed into a wall. So the next set of images I want to show you are for a space, interior and exterior elements of a space. So here we go. This photograph shows the exterior of this space that I wanted to capture, that has some nice hand-sculpted elements in these capitals. That would be time-consuming to sculpt digitally, and then it has some nice geometrically defined elements that the photogrammetry process allows you to quickly describe in a point cloud and then in a mesh model, a high-density mesh model that you then can bring into a software like Rhino for reconstruction. And because these are geometrically defined surfaces, they're fairly quick to reconstruct using a few techniques of taking profiles off of the mesh itself. So, and these columns as well, these arches. And then in the interior space, there's a dome that I'll show you in a little bit. But you don't want to have to resculpt, especially in Rhino, you don't want to have to resculpt these capitals. So it's very useful to get as much information as you can through photogrammetry and then selectively decide what you want to rebuild as surfaces, or what you want to rebuild or what you want to keep as mesh generated by the photogrammetry process. It doesn't know where I am. So 8423 is what I want. 8423. Here it is. So you can see this is the result. Over here, I'll change this to 2D. There we go. And you can see that of these images of the exterior and a little bit of the interior, I was able to capture a pretty good point cloud showing the archway and the door and the entryway threshold, as well as these hand sculpted column capitals, right? So here's the point cloud, and then it's missing some information in the point cloud there, but if we change it to, I think this may be too big for to be rendered out. Let me see. Component 1, component 0, model 1. Yeah, it's 87 million polygons. So that's going to be, I think it's too large to render in the solid mode, or even in what is called the sweep mode, which is the combination of colored texture information, or colored vertices and mesh in the mesh. But this is the exterior point cloud. And this is, once we decimate this, you can export a pretty nice mesh of this model for the exterior. And then, but once you decimate this, to get it to a reasonable size for the whole exterior threshold, you lose a lot of the information on this column capital. So what I need to do then is create a separate model just for this column capital and for these ones as well. on the left and on the right. And I'll show you what those come out as. So if I pull up my model for the column capital, 8424, just selecting photographs from that same photograph set, but just of the capital itself. You can see that I get a lot of detail here. And this can be easily cleaned up in ZBrush, and then imported into Rhino if you want to, for the geometric construction of the exterior threshold or the archway threshold. So yeah, it's a pretty nice little model. And if I bring up the color information, you can see it's a nice little model that can be worked with, and it brings in some of the shadow information as well. Maybe a little too much. That might have to be worked on. So I can capture this detail, and then if I want to capture, and then I want to show you also the interior of the space. So loading the interior. The point cloud, again, the model is way too dense, way too big. It's 123 million, 138.6 million polygons. So way too big for the software to display. But you can get an idea from the point cloud, the qualities of the interior space. And the nice thing is that I want to combine is the color information, that can be baked into the model itself for the interior shaded portion versus the exterior. And so what I'll wind up doing is using 3 different models, at least, no, five different models at least, to make the whole finished space that I would then use for visualization in a for a low poly version for game engines, or a high poly version for prototyping some element of it, or for manufacturing some element of it, or for combining into a design for manufacturing, or again for a game engine or something like that. But it's a nice little space, and it has these nice little hand sculpted elements that I want to capture. There's some over here, there's some in the middle, on the right, on the left, and then even at the top of the dome in the interior there's a nice little hand sculpted wooden portion here. And you just wind up being able to capture some really nice little details at the base of this arch as well as the door, and some of the details in the door that you can grab through photogrammetry without having to sculpt them or model them by hand. So that's the process, so that's the overview, and then the process will be simply choosing how to decimate the whole thing, bringing it to a certain level where you can export it and import into other software packages, and breaking it up into parts, for the smaller hand-sculpted elements that you want to keep a higher resolution to preserve details, versus exporting the whole interior space and the exterior threshold at lower resolutions to capture a larger area and still be able to use it to sculpt or to model a very low poly version that captures the essence of the design.